Thank you for this opportunity to speak at the NBF Conclave on this topic, which I think remains perennially relevant and important. Does the media need a watchdog? This is an age-old question. This is not something that has suddenly come out of the blue, and this goes back decades and even centuries, because certain elements have always attempted to manipulate, control, dominate the media in ways that are not legitimate, that are not ethical. So if we go back to the issue of freedom of speech and our constitutional guarantees of freedom of expression, right towards the last few decades of colonial rule, where there were attempts to have a modern, world standard freedom of speech right built into our constitution and our laws, those who led the nation in those last decades of colonial rule and in the first few years of independent India, they let us down because they entered qualifications to those rights which have then been subsequently manipulated over the decades. Many of you will remember, at least those from my generation, if not the younger ones, way back in the 1980s when Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister, there was an attempt to foist a governmental control, a watchdog over media, and that led to a furore, and that plan was dropped. From time to time, some people have tried to come up with these ideas, but look at how media has behaved itself. It's worth looking at legacy media. Look at the marquee names in media. Many of them, in fact, I would go to the extent of saying most of them, have been guilty of misrepresenting facts on the ground, which the larger public didn't always understand. Once they understood, it has not been that easy to do away with it. Many legacy media would report a riot or a murder in starkly different ways, depending on whether the perpetrator was from a particular religion, whether the victim was from a particular religion. The descriptions and whether the names of the perpetrators were to be disclosed would depend on that metric, on that prejudice, on that narrative. That narrative was set right here in the heart of the country, in this core part of the national capital, which has been called the Lutyens zone. And the media and the narrative setters who made their homes here for decades were all guilty of it. Now, this is not something that has gone away, but because of more awareness, and I believe because of the explosion in media, there's new media that takes on traditional media, both in broadcast, in digital, and other traditional formats, although you don't see print media new entrants very much. So, what some of the member broadcasting entities of NBF, for instance, have shown, and shown very assertively over recent years, were for decades actually actively suppressed, as I have just been explaining to you. Now that has questioned the power equations in a manner which has disturbed those who have wanted to control the narrative, those who have wanted to control media, and you have seen the result of that. You have seen the results. My friend Arnab Goswami has been the victim of an attempt by a state government which took upon itself to quote unquote regulate media. Of course, I use that term facetiously because what they did was break every norm of constitutionality, every norm of legality, every norm of ethics, and every norm of plain common decency. Now, the question is, if you were to have a regulatory body for media, how would it work? It's not that we haven't had them. We've had, for example, the Editors Guild of India. How have they acquitted themselves? We've had the Press Trust of India. How have they acquitted themselves? Have they stood up for the rights of citizens? Have they stood up for bold journalists exposing facts? Sadly, more in the exception than in the norm. And particularly if they fit a certain set of media entities, particularly the legacy ones.